Nine.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be talking about religion. I just wanted to make clear that I am not affiliated to any one religion, or I stand outside as a social scientist looking in, right? So if this offends you in some way, I apologize, but I'm trying to be a neutral outside observer. I'm not a Calvinist. For instance, right. So this is joint work with Stuart and my colleague at Queen's, John. And what we're doing here is we're trying to understand the origins of these things. So this is a boerenleenbank, which means farmers lending/borrowing bank, and it's located here in a farmhouse. That's how they started, or just a room in a farmhouse or in a school building, this kind of thing. So these are our research questions. We're asking, why did this brand new type of financial service, why did it emerge in rural parts of the Netherlands at the turn of the 20th century? What function did it hold in rural society at the time? How did it perform in its first decade? So there's loads of these things emerging all across the country. Did they do well? Did they do badly? Did they serve the purpose they were intentioned to perform, or did they do something else? One of the reasons why this is an important question to ask is because the inheritor of these cooperative banks, of these Raiffeisen banks, is Rabobank, one of the most important, it's a system important bank in the Netherlands, in Europe today. So it's worth thinking about just from that perspective. This is a cliometric paper, a quantitative economic history paper. I have stripped out all the regression analysis, and I'm just talking about it in words. Okay, so incumbents versus these new entrants. There were already, of course, financial services providers serving the parts of the rural countryside by the time of the entry of the boerenleenbanken, including spaarbanken, savings banks, and also the Rijkspostspaarbank, the state, the post office savings bank. So it was already in some respects a crowded market on the savings side. These are dual savings and loans institutions, so they also provide credit. So they're also operating in a space with pawn banks, Banken van Lening and Hulpbanken, which have a small-scale savings. So one of the things we've got to think about is how do they compete, or do they complement one another? So what were boerenleenbanken? Well, they were savings and loans banks owned cooperatively, crucially by borrowers. So it's different to building society, where they're owned by savers. You could borrow money from them at advantageous interest rates, right? With strings attached. How do they manage to do this? Well, they have a lower cost base, and they internalizing any profits, because they're owned by membership. They don't aim to make loads of profits. That's paid out in lower interest, if you like. These things exist elsewhere in Europe, of course. They're inspired by the German model, but there's a Dutch twist, the Catholic Protestant element, which, if I have time, I'll go into later on. So there are various different hypotheses that, as a social scientist, I would like to test. Which one of these explains why these banks emerge? Was it an extension of the socio-religious confessional politics of pillarization that the Netherlands is famous for? Was it because there's genuine economic demand for their services that was not being served by the incumbents? Or was it some sort of organizational innovation that enabled them to do the same as these incumbents, but better? Right? Or what combination of these three? So there's a vast historiography, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip this. It's in the paper. Here you see the emergence of these banks. The first such bank established in 1898 or 1897. And 10 years later, they're across the whole country, pretty much everywhere. They're ubiquitous in every rural village, many having two, one for the Protestants and one for the Catholics, right? Here you see some just the size of these networks. They're quite small still 10 years after they've emerged, but their growth is spectacular. They've come from nothing, and by the mid-century they're really important. So we have to go back to their roots. The data we've collected, Stuart and I collected. Stuart did most of the collection of these vast amounts of data. Is basically from balance sheets at the bank level. So we have information about every single one of these banks, but also their incumbents at the branch level. So we have for every post office savings bank how much is being saved at a local branch and its proximity with these new entrants. And we combine this with other data available for the period from the census to try and understand the characteristics of the area that these banks serve. And the type, the characteristics also of the savers, the customers that banked with these things. The data look like this. I was given a whole series of volumes by the ABN AMRO archive, who were kicking them out because they had double copies, or they weren't about this bank's history and they were available somewhere else. So they thought, okay, Chris can have them, and we basically used this as a starting point and digitized them. But it's really nice to have the original rather than some copies. So here you see their funding model is quite different to the incumbents, Boerenleenbank and these new entrants on the right there. Compared to Spaarbanken and compared to the state Rijkspost Spaarbank, their business model is really much more taking deposits, right, and lending these deposits to their customers. They're not buying bonds and state securities in the same way. They have a different purpose, if you like. I'll skip over this one. So the business model is very much, because they're owned by those that borrow, those that borrowed from the bank, in return they accept unlimited liability. Their objective then is to finance their loan book by taking in deposits. That's the only way they really can finance their loan book. So their objective function, if you like, is to increase the amount of deposits so that they can have this lovely loan book, low risk, banking in the community among the people of their own religious group, that they can scrutinize and punish socially if they renege on their promise to repay, all at lower cost. It's part of a club, right? So the key performance measure, if we want to look at performance across the first 10 years, is then deposit growth. It's only through growing the pool of deposits that you can fund this cool new business form. So I've talked about the performance. Other metrics, what we do is we look at the characteristics of early entrants versus later entrants. We look at also measures of social performance, including outreach, so savings banks by the population they serve at the end of the period. So we do all kind of different econometric tests with different dependent variables, and we spent a long time, or Stuart spent a long time doing this econometric analysis, which I won't show here. Instead, what I'm just going to do is give you the key results in words. So, the founding of these banks, we find, is actually highly correlated with the socio-religious mix in that area. It turns out that these banks were instigated initially by Catholics, and Protestants maybe are copying that business model. It also seems to be in locations with minority populations, Protestants or Catholics, they seem to be established earlier and more successful. Religion mattered, we argue, for their foundation. It's correlated with their foundation, but it doesn't matter for their subsequent performance. This is the last slide, don't worry. Because their subsequent performance, their outreach, their success is much more correlated with the economic fundamentals of the area that they serve. We find, for instance, that there's an element of competition between Boerenleenbanken, which is perhaps surprising, given that they're meant to be serving different religious groups. Perhaps they're not in that strict way. we find that boerenleenbanken perform much better if they're serving areas of the country with larger farms, with more farms, and with richer customers. So they're not serving the very poor. They're not like microfinance institutions. Perhaps the ideology behind them is they're serving the poor and the less well off, but in practice they're serving the growing middle class, upper class farmers. So that would be it for me.
Thank you very much. Chris Colvin.
Yes.